Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Western Heritage Center to another high noon program. This is the last in our series for 2020. As all of us know, we started these programs in March, and the world has changed for all of us. And all of these programs will be available that we've done through the year. We've had a great series of speakers on a lot of topics, topics relating to women's rights and stuff. Those are available on Community 7 TV, our community partner with these programs, and they're available on Vimeo typically. So if you go to the Community 7 website, look at the Vimeo icon in the corner, hit that, look for Western Heritage Center, and you'll be, during your holidays or the cold days of January and February, be able to come back and watch some of these fantastic programs. So my name is Kevin Koister. I'm the Executive Director of the museum. And 2021 is obviously around the corner. We hope that we have live programming where we actually invite audiences to see and experience. We all, obviously, all of us would rather be face-to-face with the people we're presenting to. But also, the opportunity to watch the videos later is also really a wonderful thing. And I do want to add one other element. One thing that COVID has really done for us at the Western Heritage Center is also rethink how we deliver the original research we do. And as I mentioned, our public programs are all recorded, and you can get those online. And Lauren and Cecilia and the staff is now working on creating virtual exhibits of our exhibits. So the staff puts a lot of time and effort into creating original research exhibits, and now in 2021 we're going to launch new exhibits online. From Healthy by Design is helping us with some support, the Heinemann Foundation, and I do want to acknowledge today's program, which is Lauren Hunley, our community historian. Up in Smoke, Lucian Smith and the Billings Fire Department wanted to thank Community 7 for their support and their partnership over the years, and also thank the Yellowstone County taxpayers who are critical to our support here. We get mill levy funds to help support the museum, and we are appreciative of the support of the Yellowstone County taxpayers, and we also receive support for the fire department exhibit that was Lauren's baby from the CARES Act relief grants through Humanities Montana and through the Montana Arts Council. We really, I don't know why I would be pleasantly surprised, but we are so appreciative of the support we get in this community, especially in this time. And obviously, we all support each other, all the nonprofits. So without further ado, we have a program called Up in Smoke. Lucian Smith and the Billings Fire Department. Lauren Hunley, she's back there somewhere behind that podium, has spent over 15 years in the museum field. She earned her Master's of Arts in Learning and Visitor Services in Museums and Galleries through Leicester University in England, and she's worked for both small museums and national museum service organizations. She is the author of 101 museum programs on a shoestring budget and has presented at numerous museum conferences. She's currently, as I mentioned, the community historian of the Western Heritage Center in Billings and serves on the board of directors for the Mountain Plains Museums Association. With great pleasure, Lauren.
Thank you. Okay. Let me set my timer so that I am respectful of your time too. So I'm really appreciative and grateful and thankful that I'm able to share this story with you guys today. Today's presentation grew out of the research for the exhibit that's currently upstairs, Up in Smoke, the Billings Fire Department. And a really huge special thanks to Billings Fire Chief Kevin Bentz and IAFF Local Chapter 521. They gave us access to really almost their entire archive, some amazing objects on loan, and allowed us to kind of dig into some of these stories that we kind of had an inkling about. In the process of putting that exhibit together, I came across this specific figure who continued to pop up his name came up, his name came up, his name came up in a variety of different ways and in more and more leadership positions. And I'm not gonna lie, I kind of fell in love with him a little bit. At least fell in love with his involvement in his story. Unfortunately, the exhibit storyline was too big to really camp out and share his story in that space. So I'm taking the advantage today to really get into the nitty-gritty and the details of who Lucian Smith was and why he's so important. On a side note, the Up in Smoke Billings Fire Department exhibit will be open the rest of this week and then next Wednesday and next Saturday. So if you haven't seen it yet, you have a very small window, and I encourage you because I think it did turn out to be a really great exhibit. Okay. So in order to talk about Lucian, I have to give you a little bit of context. The early days of firefighting in Billings are very colorful. Professional organized fire protection did not come to Billings until 1887, 5 years after the city was established. The Yellowstone Hook and Ladder Company, founded in 1887, but it was founded without a budget. There was no funds associated with that. Before the Yellowstone Hook and Ladder Company, people were basically told that you should keep a water barrel and a bucket handy. That was the extent of fire protection in Billings before then. And then they established this company, this fire station, fire company, but they don't give them any money. So in order to build the coffers, in order to build the budget, regular poker games established pay lines and money for equipment. Unfortunately, poker tends to lead to other activities. Not all of them are legal. And only 18 months after the company was established, the mayor filed a formal complaint because of their behavior, specifically their behavior at the mayor's livery stable. And in protest of this complaint, so in protest of the protest, the entire company resigns. So 18 months after Billings tries to establish a department, the entire company resigns in protest and Billings is back to square one. It's at this point that we see the Maverick Volunteer Fire Company established. Now, a lot of people, when they think of historic Billings firefighting, the Maverick Company is what comes to mind. It was an all-volunteer corps. They had lots of really great anecdotal stories associated with them, but they were only in operation for less than 20 years. The Maverick Volunteer Fire Company, established in 1889, was completely disbanded and the station was abandoned in 1918. What we understand today as the Billings Fire Department was established in 1909 when the city appointed 3 professional firefighters to man Station 1, which was in City Hall, to man that station 24 hours a day. Now, before then, there was a station there. Volunteers would come in and out. They helped care for the horses that pulled the apparatus, but they weren't professional firefighters. So the professional component of the Billings Fire Department, founded in 1909. 3 years later, the city purchases their first motorized fire apparatus, basically their first fire truck. The following year, they retire the last horse. So horse-drawn fire apparatus are completely gone in Billings by 1913. Over the next 20 years, the department is really the sole responder to fire emergencies within the city limits. Now, as the city grew, the number and the severity of the fires grew proportionally or even greater. And this caused thousands of dollars of damage every year. It was obviously a huge danger to life and limb. And things had to change. Now, Montana makes fire history in 1935. So we're going to jump forward to 1935, when Montana becomes the first state in the country to grant firefighters an 8-hour workday. Now, there have obviously been a lot of iterations for a firefighter's workday. Today, they do not have an 8-hour workday in most stations. But this was really groundbreaking in understanding and protecting labor efforts from firefighters. This same act provided the first paid time off for Montana firefighters, and it established a statewide minimum wage, which was $160 a month. That's actually, if we were to adjust for inflation, that's about $3,000 a month. This is not something to sneeze at. And that was the minimum, and they provided a promotional raise component. They built that in. So 1935 is kind of when we start seeing things change in regards to professional firefighting. When we take that and we apply it to Billings, 1935, the Billings Fire Department has 3 vehicles, 3 apparatus, a ladder truck, a chemical wagon, which actually technically was not operated by the fire department. It was operated by the Smith Cab Company, but they brought it to all the fires, and a high pressure wagon, which actually had a monitor nozzle, which was pretty high tech. We balanced that high tech monitor nozzle on the pressure wagon with the ladder truck. The ladder truck is actually a 1916 model. So they're still using a 1916 ladder truck in 1935 in Billings. That truck is actually listed as an active vehicle well into the 40s. So gives us a little bit of context, I guess. There are 15 paid firefighters on the roster, that they are supplemented by 10 more firefighters who are available on an on-call basis. These on-call men include students, the traffic officer, and of course the men of the Smith Taxi Company who manned that chemical wagon. In order to be a professional firefighter in Billings, you had to be between 21 and 30 years old, so a very tight age range. You had to complete 6 months of training, which was about half and half first aid training and half fire training in how to fight fires, so only 6 months of training. You worked in a 2-platoon system of 12-hour shifts, so there were 7 men on duty at all times, split over 2 stations. So 2 stations in Billings, each station had 3 men always on shift. And then the duties included, obviously firefighting, but they could also inspect for fire hazards. Unfortunately, that inspection didn't really come with a lot of enforcement power. You could basically say these people, this is a fire hazard and you can choose to clean it up. And then civic cleanup activities were really a part of what they did. In February 1935, fire history, I guess, local history is made with the Babcock Theater. It's one of our most remembered blazes. There was a boxing match being held on the stage of the theater, and somebody dropped a cigarette that rolled underneath the platform that they were using and caught fire. Now, by the time the flames had grown to be damaging and dangerous, the boxing match was actually over, but it completely gutted the interior of that theater space. Damages up to $150,000. That is not adjusted for inflation. So $150,000 in damage. And really the only reason the theater was damaged the way it was and the commercial buildings were saved is because there was a huge brick firewall that separated the 2 spaces. However, those businesses did not escape. They all kept extra inventory in the basement, as well as a bowling alley, I believe, that was down there. So when the firefighters were spraying water, all that water is affected by gravity, it floods the basement. So even though the commercial spaces were saved from the flames, those businesses had massive damage to their inventory stock. But perhaps for us, the biggest reason why 1935 is the year that we start with is because Lucian Smith joins the fire department full-time. Lucian had actually been associated with the fire department since 1933, off and on. He was really one of those volunteers. Didn't really have a lot of training, just kind of had an interest, but he's finally able to join the department full-time in 1935 when he was 29. Now, Lucian was originally born in Bowling Green, Kentucky, 1903. And he moved to Montana in 1916 as a young teenager. He was the second youngest of 4 boys, Lester, Lyman, Lucian, and Leon. I guess their parents had a theme and they ran with it. They moved to the outskirts of Yellowstone County in 1916. And Lucian, we see his name pop up as a laborer for the rail yard in Laurel. He keeps books for a store in Billings for a little bit. He moves to Billings within the city limits in 1927. In 1929, he marries Evelyn Power, who was originally from Columbus, Montana. And then, of course, joining the fire department in 1935, where he would spend the next 21 years professionally. Lucian joins the department in July of 1935. July 1st is his first day on the job. July 25th is probably one of the most damaging fires in Billings history. During a welding operation, a spark ignites a tank full of oil at the Yale oil yards. As that tank burns, the surrounding tanks under heat stress start expanding and cracking, and oil seeks out. It completely saturates the ground, quickly catches fire, and then spreads to the entire yard. It took the firefighters over 3 hours to contain 10 full tanks of oil on fire simultaneously. No less than 11 different explosions occurred during this time. This was Lucian's first major call. This is the first time he responds to a fire, and what a doozy, huh? It actually gets worse for him. When he arrives on scene and he's given the information about the fire, he's actually informed that the fire has killed 4 oil field employees, one of which is his younger brother, Leon. So for his very first major fire call, his brother dies in the blaze. The newspaper reports, quote, probably the most crestfallen fireman was L.B. Smith, recent addition to the local department, who was combating his first major blaze when Chief Steele was sending some of the men and apparatus back to headquarters shortly before 5. He ordered Smith to return with the aerial ladder truck. Tears welled into the youthful firefighter's eyes. I guess I lost a brother in that inferno, Chief, he said, trying to keep from crying. His brother Leon Smith was one of the welders hurt in the explosion. This says hurt. Leon died pretty quickly. The Yale oil fire really brought home, not only for Leon, and truthfully, would anybody have blamed him if he had quit at that point, but for the entire department, it really brought home the inherent dangers of firefighting. And 2 years later, in order to protect the firefighters' efforts, to protect their jobs, and to advocate for them, the firefighters band together and unionized. They chartered a local chapter of the International Association for Firefighters, Local 521. This is a copy of the original charter that you see here, and we can see Lucian's name right up front, putting his name on this, recognizing that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make firefighting a safe profession, not only for his fellow firefighters, but for his community. By the way, Local 521 is still active in Billings. They're very active and they're awesome. So those efforts are continuing. 1940, we see probably the most photographed disaster in Billings history, the Northern Hotel fire. Early in the morning on September 11th, 1940, a young girl notices smoke coming out of the basement windows and casement windows of the Northern Hotel. All guests are able to be evacuated. In fact, the hotel clerk had to use the exterior fire escape stairs to actually get up to the upper floors to notify people of the fire. All guests were evacuated, but the building was considered a total loss. Firefighters from across the city came in to fight the blaze. It took many, many hours to get it under control. Added to those duties was crowd control. Of course, the fire drew huge crowds. You could see the blaze for miles, apparently. And so not only are the firefighters trying to actually fight this blaze, fight this fire, they're also trying to keep people away from the blaze itself. When we're talking about something that's this big and burning this hot, truthfully, you need people several blocks away, and in this photograph, you can see they're literally standing across the street. In the Northern Hotel fire, only one person is reported injured. It's a firefighter. Guess who it is? Lucian Smith, overcome by smoke, is taken to the hospital, where he basically checks himself out and returns to the blaze. The only man listed injured, the only person listed injured as part of the Northern Hotel fire. Lucian's dedication really becomes evident to the higher-ups in the station, in the department, but also to the city. And between 1944 and 1943, we see a period of really, really quick advancement for Lucian. So he's only been at the fire station or at the fire department for 7 years. He's got some experience. He's kind of proven himself, I think, in a lot of ways at this point. He's had some pretty heavy personal experiences with fire, and he's still at it. He's still fighting for the Union. He's still fighting for his city. We see this dedication rewarded in November of 1942 when he's promoted to fire captain, which means he's now like basically the station manager is basically how that comes out. By February 1943, he's named assistant fire chief, which means he's head honcho number 2. When Chief Steele retires a few months later, he is named acting fire chief. During his time as acting fire chief, he's actually named Deputy State Fire Marshal of Montana, which gives him a lot of authority for enforcing state laws associated with fire prevention. And then he's officially given the job of Billings Fire Chief in November of 1943. So in really 1 year, November 1942 to November 1943, he has advanced 4 major placements. Really quick, but he's totally, at least he illustrates that he's totally up for the job. In 1943, it's probably a good thing that they have a man like Lucian Smith at the helm, because in 1943, things change. The National Board of Fire Underwriters, which was a national organization that established fire insurance rates, so local insurance agents could look at the rating system that the National Fire Underwriters used, and that's what would determine what the amount of money they could insure something or what those insurance rates would be. The National Board established a grading schedule that provided a national standard to rate protective services and to determine insurance rates. They rated 1 best, all the way to 7, which was the worst. In 1943, Billings is rated a class 6. And truthfully, they skim into 6 by the skin of their teeth. They were only a handful of points from a class 7 rating. The grading system looked at water supply, the fire department, building laws, fire hazards, structural conditions, police responses, and the ability and capacity of the fire alarm system. All of those received an individual score that was then brought together to create a citywide score. On a complete side note, by the way, the Billings water supply system was graded a number 1. So just a little nod to the successful irrigation and water processing that Billings had. Everything else failed miserably. We see in 1943 that this is a big deal. So much fire damage, being rated a class 6, shows that the regular citizens are going to be paying out of the pocket monthly in order to protect their properties, simply because of the fact that the city and the fire department cannot be insured to protect private property. The city knows that they have to do something about this. In fact, 1943 and 1944, Billings fire loss was 5 times the average for the state of Montana. To help combat this, the city establishes the Bureau of Fire Protection and Prevention. The Bureau's goals included reducing the city's fire loss, passing fire prevention ordinances to correct dangerous conditions, and then being able to enforce those ordinances and those codes, growing the fire department's manpower, increasing training for those firefighters, investigating causes of fire to then use as education and use as support for changes that need to be made, and then of course educating the community on those activities and those community efforts. As the Billings Fire Chief, and of course because of what we see evidence of his personal feelings about fire prevention, Lucian Smith is a natural appointee to this bureau. And we see right away, Lucian understands and recognizes that he has to prove the value of the bureau. He understands really quickly that in order to justify the money that we're going to have to put out in order to support the changes that need to happen, he's going to have to justify this socially. He's also going to have to justify the bottom line. So we can see this just with a real quick, actually, perusal, real quick look at these annual reports from the fire department. So the 1942 annual report was submitted by Lucian's predecessor, Chief Steele. It's about a page and a half. You know, it has some information. It basically shows the firefighting budget, how much they spent on payroll and equipment upkeep. That second half page is just a list of the fires that they ran in the city. 1943 is the first report that Lucian submits. After he'd only officially had the title for less than a month, he has to submit this final annual report. It's already longer. He's already giving more detail. And then 1944, the first year under the Bureau, they immediately start making changes and start advocating and pushing for new training. And we see that in his annual report for 1944. It is 14 pages long. And this isn't just flowery language or fluff that he's filling the page with. This is detailed financial information. He outlines the increased training that the firefighters have undergone. He gives really heavy details on full equipment and station evaluations. This is the apparatus we currently have. This is how we overhauled it. This is how long we can continue to use this apparatus. This is what still needs to be replaced on these vehicles. His detailed reporting includes a breakdown for the firefighters under his command. He's not just giving a roll call, he's breaking out vacation hours. He's breaking out how much training they've all logged. So this is a really, really vital piece of information that he's using to justify the types of requests that he's going to start making. When we look really detailed and look into the documentation itself, we see that he's acknowledging the difference, the immediate difference that his efforts have made. We see here in the 1944 report, it says, "You will notice that under classification of alarms, building fires over the entire city are about the same as in the year 1943. However, the value is lower by more than $500,000 unadjusted. And there has been a decided decrease in the number of losses of these high-valued costs." So in other words, even though the alarm numbers are the same on the surface, 1943 to 1944, when we look at the actual fire loss, financial fire loss, Billings has already saved $500,000 with just the changes that they've already made. And Lucian is very upfront in crediting the increased training that the firefighters have already received. It says more modern practices of firefighting, training, and salvage work are some of the contributing factors for keeping the fire loss at a minimum. So he's already saying, thank you for paying for this new training. We've already saved the city $500,000. We don't have the financial figure of how much that training cost the city, but I guarantee you it was nowhere near $500,000. He goes on with his numbers and he breaks down the fire loss per capita. And he gives the comparison of 1943 in the same report. So if we look, per capita losses based on a population of a little over 23,000 people, 1943, the loss per capita was $14.62. 1944, same population, that loss is down to $3.22. This is a 127% difference. If we were to adjust this for inflation, it would be almost $200 per person in savings from the efforts that they have already put out. And Lucian understands that for many people, he has to speak to the bottom line. He has to appeal to that bottom line first. And he's not even subtle about it. If we look at the letterhead for the Bureau of Fire Prevention, that tagline is at the bottom. It pays to help prevent fires. He's not even trying to be subtle about it. He understands how he has to make his argument, and he's using this financial angle to justify and to push for more change, for more efforts in fire prevention. These efforts are partially successful, actually we could probably say largely successful, in 1945 for the passing of the Billings Fire Prevention Code. This code is really the first time we see, one, it establishes the Bureau of Fire Prevention under a city ordinance, which means that the city is now required by law under this ordinance to have the Bureau. So Lucian has totally proven the value of the Bureau and that, hey, we should keep this around. Perhaps more importantly, it gives the Bureau the authority to enforce this code, which means they don't just go around and say, hey, that's dangerous, you should fix it. They can now fine people and bring them under the auspices of the city in order to take care of these fire hazards. We also see a little tie back to 1935. We see that under this new code, it bans smoking in theaters and places of public amusement. Anybody remember the Babcock Theater? It's still very much in recent memory here in 1945. It was only 10 years ago. And they make it official that, hey, guess what? You can't smoke in theaters and these other places of public amusement that have a stage, essentially is how it comes down. This is also the first time we see it established that emergency exits must be unblocked and well lit. Now, of course, they're not saying you have to have a lit exit sign above your door, but it does have to be accessible. And people have to be able to see that that's how you can escape the building. It also requires fire extinguishers in garages, in apartment buildings, and warehouses and schools. And this is the first time we see that law really put in writing here in Billings as well. It includes a couple other pieces that are pretty groundbreaking, and they establish a foundation for some of the things that we still deal with today. Some of the codes and the ordinances that are still on the books in Billings have their root, they have their foundation in this 1945 Fire Prevention Code, which was passed largely because of Lucian and the Bureau of Fire Protection's efforts. Of course, now that the law has changed, people have to know that the law has changed. I mean, we know that ignorance is not a defense against the law, but, you know, if you've done something a certain way for years and years and years, and now all of a sudden you're going to fine me because I'm doing the same thing, it's going to create some issues. So Lucian takes it upon the fire department to establish these education efforts. 1945 is when we see the fire department really start pushing out and educating the community for fire prevention. This is when we see the first fire drills in area schools come under this push, under these programs. We see speaking engagements at clubs. Lucian starts giving presentations to junior women's clubs, 4-H programs, teacher union meetings, the Lions Club, the Rotary. He shows up in the newspaper all the time making these presentations about fire prevention, and he's tailoring his presentation to the club that he's speaking to. So for example, when he's speaking to women's clubs, he's talking about preventing fires in the kitchen space and in the home. Whereas when he's speaking to the Lions and to the Rotary Club, he's spending more time talking about fire prevention in businesses and commercial spaces. So he's tailoring the information to his audience. This is also when we see the fire department establish the annual Chamber of Commerce dinner. They're hosting a community meal at the station. And Lucian really feels that this is one of the most important things that they do because it improves public relations with the department. It helps make the firefighters approachable and recognizable in the community. I actually love this photograph because everybody at that far table is wearing a fire hat. So if you think about the really super serious businessmen in Billings in 1945, and they're all wearing a fire hat, which I think is just really fun. And it speaks to Lucian's goal of keeping the meal, the dinner light and inclusive and being able to build a network with the community. Lucian also establishes regular station tours, including, he gives it to students, but he also gives it to the city council, especially when he knows he's going to be making a big pitch for equipment or for more men. He invites the city council into the station so that they can see kind of the behind the scenes of what the fire department does, maintaining those communication lines. And by the following year, 1945, so the activities in 1945 create a foundation, and the response from the community is so positive that by the following year they establish the Fire Prevention Week program, which actually continues today. The Fire Prevention Week was established, I believe, by FDR nationally, right before World War II, but it doesn't become a thing. It doesn't become a planned community-wide effort in Billings until about 1945, 1946. And during Fire Prevention Week, the mayor's office always made a proclamation establishing the week. News broadcasts, church programs, Boy Scout programs, Girl Scout contests, window displays, public films, service club presentations. Schools would actually distribute scorecards to the students, so the student could then go home and judge their own home. They could basically do their own fire inspection, hazard inspection at their house. And then if they turned their scorecard back into the school, those cards would be given to the fire department, and the winning card would actually, the student would, and their parents would actually get a little certificate, a little award. So we can actually see in this photograph, Lucian is giving one of those fire prevention awards to the winning students in Billings. We even see citywide inspections coming in. The fire department is using Fire Prevention Week as a perfect opportunity to get into businesses and commercial buildings in a safe and friendly manner. Nobody wants to invite the fire marshal or the fire department in because they're afraid they're going to tell you to change something. Fire Prevention Week and hosting these contests is a great way to build community support and to kind of enter these spaces in a safe way and a fun way. My notes are stuck. We see this helpful by 1948. We start seeing major financial investments on behalf of the city into really working for fire prevention and fire department. In 1948, the city installs a brand new fire call box system. There are 37 boxes strategically placed around the city. This system replaced the 10-box system from 1904. So it's kind of due for a new upgrade. The new boxes were arranged so that no resident was more than 300 feet from a fire alarm system. And each box included a private telephone exchange and a separate shortwave radio frequency. And all of the fire trucks and all of the stations were equipped with the paired radio and telephone exchange. Now, interestingly enough, Lucian actually lived on 6th Avenue North, right at the edge of where the city was at that time. And it took a special city appropriation to extend the fire exchange and the radio to his house. So not only were the stations and the fire trucks getting word when an alarm was set off, Lucian was on call 24/7. He was also getting notice at his home. Now, these boxes were actually pretty successful, except for one small thing, which paired right in with Lucian's focus on education and educating the community. A lot of people thought the boxes were post boxes. So they would open it to drop in their outgoing mail, and in the process of opening it, it would set off the alarm. So the first couple of months of this installation, there were a whole lot of false alarms because people were putting their mail into the fire alarm box. On a side note, we do have one of these fire alarms one of these boxes on display in our exhibit upstairs. So you can see an original one. They're really cool. Lucian is able to really start seeing the benefit of his work and the Fire Bureau's work to this point. And they're really starting to get the financial support to expand the department to best meet the needs of their community. The brand new fire station, station number 3, opens in Pioneer Park. The building is actually still there today, although it's no longer a fire station. And with that brand new station that opened in 1948, it came with a fully equipped ambulance, as well as 2 oxygen inhalers for patient use. Now, I will say that those oxygen inhalers, they were donated by the Yellowstone County chapter of the American Red Cross. They were really the only 2 functioning oxygen inhalers that the department had over all 3 stations, which was something that Lucian would really talk about. He'd spend a lot of time focusing on this. With the new station also comes more men. He's able to hire 13 more firefighters. And of course, with this increased staff, he's able to expand their training opportunities. So now they're able to start giving fire extinguisher demonstrations to businesses and to school teachers, and really getting this information out there. You know, the city is requiring these spaces to have a fire extinguisher, but it doesn't do you any good if nobody knows how to operate them. And then, of course, we also see 35 new fire hydrants being installed around the city. So now we're seeing a huge benefit in extending access of the water supply. Now, all of these efforts are amazing, but they don't stop the fires. In 1949, the Baker Warehouse fire was pretty devastating. It was a $500,000 loss. The fire itself was started by boys playing around the railroad tracks with a book of matches, and it caught right away. This fire, though, gives us a really interesting insight into how Lucian Smith operated and how he took advantage of his situations, not only to do his job, but to also encourage people towards fire prevention activities. During his interview and his inspection report for the warehouse fire here, he pointed out that the lack of fire doors greatly contributed to the rate of fire expansion within the building, and that simply installing a few fire doors would have cut the loss in half or greater. We see him doing the same thing. I remember I mentioned those 2 oxygen inhalers. There's a call where a gas leak at a commercial or at a private home renders a family, so a husband and wife and their 5-year-old son, it renders them unconscious. And their neighbor, unable to wake them, calls the fire department, and the fire department has to work on this family for over 45 minutes with 2 oxygen inhalers, so they have to keep trading them off. And Smith says flat out that this kind of case stresses the need of the department for additional equipment. You know, if there had been 2 children instead of 1, we probably would have lost 1. That we have to have this equipment. So they're using what they have to best meet the needs of the community as they are able, but Smith is able to take these situations and show people why arguments for new training, new equipment, updated, and more manpower, why these things are so important. He's not just making this argument to spend money. He's not just making this argument to make the argument. He's doing it because he wants to protect the people in his community. And we can see his success. By 1950, the department has grown so much with manpower that they're able to specialize what they focus on. You know, a firefighter is able to specialize on truck maintenance, or he's able to specialize on first aid versus combating fire, or he's able to specialize in commercial fire, like large space fire versus residential fire. In the 1950 annual report, Lucian writes, originally fire departments were organized for combat only. This has been changed to a more technical and educational profession, of which fire combat is now only one of the many functions of the department. To meet this change, the officers and members have specialized in certain phases of our activities, in ever-changing conditions relative to how new processes and technical procedures. So because the firefighters are now able to specialize, that expands the rate of emergencies that the fire department is able to adequately meet. Before, 3 to 6 months of first aid training, we can go out and we can throw water on a fire, but we might not really be able to help anybody who comes out of that blaze. Now, because that they're specializing, now that they have people who are able to focus in on first aid, now we have firefighters who are able to both combat the blaze and render life-saving care. The success of all of these efforts comes together and is evidenced in the last portion of this 1950 annual report, because Lucian Smith, just very straightforward, says on June 26th, officials of the National Board of Fire Underwriters made the official announcement that they reduced the classification of Billings from a Class 6 to a Class 4. Billings improved their insurance fire rating classification by 2 whole classes in less than a decade. This is kind of a big deal. From what I've been able to put together in my research, it usually takes around 5 years to improve 1 class rating. And part of that is because of the financial funding appropriations for that. It depends on construction rates. If you need a new station, it takes time to actually build a new station. It takes time to train the men that you need for that. Billings is able to jump 2 whole classifications in less than a decade, and this saves property owners annually between $100,000 and $135,000 a year in premiums. It's a lot of money. This classification, or I should say reclassification, also puts Billings among the top 11 cities in its classification groups in the country. So it's now become a top 15 city. This gains it national attention. In 1951, the Hartford Agent, which was it was a magazine put out by the Hartford Fire Insurance Company, specifically for their agents. They'd highlight the agent of the year and, here's a cool story from here, a case study from here. In 1951, the Hartford Agent ran a story called How Fire Protection Became a Community Project. And it highlighted the Billings efforts. And it says, the fire department is a credit to your chief. Even in the national recognition, Lucian Smith is getting credit, and his role is being recognized. As the population continues to grow, Smith does not allow the fire department to sit back. They've gotten some great success. They've improved to a class 4. Let's take a breath. Let's sit back and enjoy our spoils. And Lucian says absolutely not, and he continues pushing forward. In 1953, the population of Billings jumped over 3,000 people in a single year. So of course, this requires more equipment, more men, a new station to be able to adequately cover these people. We now have a Class 4. If we want to keep that class rating, we have to keep our emergency response, our ability to respond to these emergencies safely. Despite that increase in population, Billings only reported $3,200. That's $3,200 lost for commercial fires. Back, 1944, so less than 10 years before, and Billings had their fire loss was 5 times the state average, and here they're reporting less than $3,500 lost in commercial fires. It's a bit of a difference. These efforts are working. The community is starting to learn fire prevention activities and incorporate these activities into their daily lives. Smith is able to secure appropriations, and the Terry Park station, station number 4, opens just a year or 2 later. It includes 13 more men to man that station. The city also purchases a new combination aerial fire truck. It had an 85-foot hydraulic ladder. It could hold 750 gallons of water, and it had pipe attachments that actually could attach to the ladder itself, so you could turn that 85-foot ladder into a water tower, so you could extend the ladder up and shoot water at your fire from above, which is kind of cool. It's pretty neat. More fire hydrants are added, but with the increase in population and the additional stations, it takes a little bit more organization on the fire department's effort, or on the fire department's side, to assign who's responding to what emergency. We now have multiple fire emergencies coming in simultaneously. How do we dictate which station and which truck at which station responds? So in 1955, Lucian establishes the communications division of the Billings Fire Department, and it takes 4 firefighters off of the trucks and puts them in a dispatch center. So now these are the men who are getting that fire emergency information from those fire alarm boxes, and they're the ones sending out the firefighters. They're the ones kind of making that management decision about who's responding where. Now, 1944 was probably a good thing that all of these improvements have been made and the new fire trucks been purchased and there are new stations, because we see a lot of damage, a lot of fire damage in 1954. In a single year, we see Bob's Surplus, the Lyric Theater, Hall's Garage, and several hotel fires all happen within a single year. The Bob's Surplus sporting goods store, which was on Montana Avenue, was an all-alarm fire. It required every firefighter in the city to get that fire under control and put it out. The Lyric Theater, which was considered the year's most dangerous fire. The theater had some chemicals in storage that all caught fire, creates some issues. Hall's Garage fire was considered the highest loss. Was nearly $100,000 loss in that vehicle, or in that fire. What we see, though, is that 63% of the most damaging fires, so including these that we've discussed, were caused by human carelessness, mostly by careless smokers. In fact, all of those hotel fires were caused by careless smokers. Despite this, 1954 and 1955, Billings had the lowest fire insurance rates in Montana. But 1954 really provides the impetus and the justification for Lucian Smith to advocate and for the city council to update that fire code. And in the updated version of the fire code, it makes smoking in bed a legal offense. So now all of those hotel fires from people carelessly smoking in bed, now those men can be charged up to a $100 fine, which would be about $1,000 today. It also, this new update also required residents to report all fires on their property within 24 hours. This is actually the first time that this particular ordinance is put in writing. And that carried up to a $300 fine here in Billings. Of course, new updates mean we have to keep educating people and we can't stop. Every year brings new school kids that we need to educate on how to prevent fires at home. New buildings are coming up, old buildings are being repurposed. We have to stay on top of our fire prevention activities and our education programs. In the early 1950s, we see these activities expand. Fire Prevention Week now includes a parade, speeches. Ministers, church pastors are encouraged to include fire prevention in Sunday sermons. In the summer of 1951, the Billings Fire Department inspected more than 7,750 homes. They really actually did that in 2 months. So they're really getting out into the community. We see the establishment of a firefighter for a day program that invited high school students. It was actually a co-ed program, invited high school students into the fire station. It served as a dual fire prevention program and a recruitment program. We also see the establishment of the Billings Flame Girl competition. This was essentially a beauty pageant, and girls, women, would be photographed in bathing suits or in other outfits, illustrating what not to do. So in the photograph you see here, she's actually smoking next to an open can of gasoline. There are also photos of a woman in a bathing suit and high heels with faulty wiring hanging over the wall. So there's a lot going on. They're really doing everything they can to get the information out there. And this results in some national recognition. From 1945 to 1954, Billings wins first place in the state for their fire prevention activities. In fact, this results in 1955 and I believe 1957, the Montana State Firefighters Convention is held in Billings. They received 2 National Honorable Mention Awards for their fire prevention activities, 1951 and 1953. 1952, so that's split year, 1952, they actually won 3rd place in the US for their classification. And in 1953, they actually won 1st place in the US for their classification for their fire waste contest. So the efforts that the department and the Bureau and that Lucian are pushing and driving are gaining ground. It gets to the point where other fire departments across the country are encouraged to come into Billings to take notes. Lucian is hosting fire chiefs from Indiana and Virginia and California and telling them how they made the updates and the changes that they did. Now, by 1956, Lucian feels like he's hit the end. He has some external personal things going on that he'd really like to refocus his attention on. So he retires. He announces his retirement in 1956. I actually find the article that you see here really interesting because it was run in the Great Falls Tribune. So where else do you see a Billings fire chief whose retirement makes statewide news? I think this really speaks to the respect that Lucian had gained and the Billings Fire Department had gained, not only across the state, but across the country. Now, Lucian is replaced by Assistant Fire Chief Sidney Morse, but that doesn't mean Lucian went away completely. He actually continues to help and represent Morse at certain events and in certain capacities. In fact, in 1957, Lucian is who presented to the city council. He said that the department was at capacity and they needed more men, another station, and 2 more trucks. He argued that the increase in insurance rates would actually be more than what the department was asking for financially. This eventually led, he was eventually successful actually in increasing the minimum wage. Remember, Lucian was hired under the $160 a month statewide established minimum wage. Billings in 1957 increases that to $350 per month for a 40-hour work week. So during Lucian's tenure, he increased the station by 25 men, and when he left, he had the budget to add an additional 12. He oversaw the management, the planning, the building, and the opening of 2 additional fire stations. He oversaw and advocated for the new 37-box alarm system. Nearly 40 new fire hydrants were installed under his time as Billings chief. And he and guided the fire department through 2 city annexations. This added nearly 1,000 homes, 15 businesses, 3 churches, 3 schools, and if you look at that bottom number, almost 40,000 people added that the fire department is now responsible for. Now that population increase includes the annexations, but it also includes just the general increase of the Billings population. That is a 77% population increase during his tenure as Billings Fire Chief. It's pretty impressive as far as I'm concerned. He leaves behind a model community. Chief Morse continues the Fire Bureau and Chief Smith's efforts. In 1957, they placed 17th in the country for their fire prevention activities, and they're considered one of the best cities in the West for its adoption of the additional codes and the prevention activities. Morse is very intentional about maintaining the programs that Smith established. Lucian still pops up periodically at events and making reports and continuing the effort. But under Chief Morse, we see the first civilian dispatchers hired for the department in 1960, and this frees up those 4 firefighters to go back onto active duty in the trucks. They receive a National Chamber of Commerce award, and they continue building new stations and opening the station to tours. They start a babysitting education program, so they're educating babysitters of how to handle any fire emergencies that might come up when they're basically the adult, when they're the ones in charge of the kids at home. Billings consistently ranks below the national average for fire loss and fire death. Now, Lucian Smith dies in 1984. During his time with the fire department, he brought Billings from 1944, 5 times the state average for fire loss, to one of the best cities in the country for fire loss and for fire prevention activities. And he established massively successful fire prevention activities that ripple to today. Today's Billings Fire Department has 110 first responders, and they manage 37 apparatus over 7 stations plus a training facility. They average 23 rescues and EMS calls a day. And oh, by the way, they've improved our insurance classification yet again. Billings is now currently a Class 3. Specifically, we see the programs that Lucian established continue. Increased training for on-duty firefighters. 2019, they logged 28,000 training hours. The Fire Prevention Bureau inspected nearly 1,000 locations, and they reached nearly 4,000 children and adults through planned fire prevention programs. This includes station visits, this includes school programming, and of course those school fire drills that we all remember so fondly. Those were all established here in Billings under Lucian. So with that, I'd like to remind you of Lucian's community focus. And the fire station was actually a drop-off site and collection site for Christmas toys for underprivileged children. So here we can see toys with the fire turnout gear behind them. I would like to wish you a Merry Christmas, a Happy Holidays, and I will open the floor for any questions or comments in association with Lucian.
I just have one question. That was a great program. What resources are available, for example, like at the Western Heritage Center? You showed all these great photographs.
Sure.
Can people access some of these photographs?
They can. So the Western Heritage Center has roughly 30,000 objects, historic photographs, ephemera documents. Most of the photographs, actually I think all the photographs that you saw in the presentation today are part of our permanent collection, which means that they are available for researchers to come in and view. We are really well covered from about 1945 to about 1977. Anything on either side of that, we're still a little iffy on, but we do have those photographs. The document scans, the document images that you saw in my presentation all came from the Billings Fire Department and Local 521. So those documents are available to us for research purposes only. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. I hope everybody makes it in for the exhibit.